Para hacer la discusión un poquito más fluida, voy a hacer las preguntas y las conversaciones en inglés. So we're going to shift to English now and do it. And this side of the platform are the experts on soccer. We're going to be the next World Cup winner, David, for sure. And that side of the table are the experts on energy, and we're going to discuss energy today. I think there were extremely interesting aspects that you mentioned, and I'd like to start maybe asking you something about the shale production in the US and two implications. Maybe for you, Assistant Secretary Smith, the first question is, in Colombia there's been a tremendous discussion about the environmental concerns around shale oil and shale gas aspects and the whole aspect of hydraulic fracturing. How has the US dealt with that, and what would be your recommendation to a newcomer like Colombia on that aspect?
So great question, and a really important one that we spend a lot of time working really hard on. So, a lot of the panelists have spoken, at length about the technological innovations that have led to the increase in shale gas production and shale oil production. Going along with that is the challenge of local governments and state governments and federal governments to understand the environmental issues that are associated with shale gas. This is something that we've done well in some areas and have done less well in other areas. Shale gas really started, the first production was in the Barnett Shale in Texas, and around the Fort Worth, Texas area. It's a place that has a long history of oil and gas production, and so the local communities had a relatively high level of comfort with the processes, with being around these industrial processes, all this drilling. As that activity moved to the East Coast and moved to areas where there wasn't a recent history of oil and gas exploration, we found that there were a lot of challenges in the company's ability to work with local communities to address some of the issues that deal with not only the environmental issues dealing with the drilling itself, but also the surface impact issues, the trucks, all the other disturbances that come along with the process. And so, one thing I think that we've learned is that starting from the process of, or from the point of view of gaining that community acceptance, of taking concerns seriously, of ensuring that there's a clear and transparent set of rules, and that those rules are understood, both by the local communities and by the producers, is something that's a really positive step. Because as we've seen in other parts of the world, I think that first of all, it's gotten a lot better in the United States. The level of social acceptance is much higher. But once you lose that, once you've lost the confidence of communities in your ability to produce safely and in a way that's consistent with our environmental values, it's very, very difficult to gain that back. So I think the groundwork that Colombia is doing right now to put in place the rules, and that's moving along here. There's still some challenges in permitting, et cetera, but doing that first, I think, is really important.
David, maybe combining the issue of shale gas and the OPEC countries, many people have said that actually the non-cutting of production and the keeping the prices low of the, at least GCC countries that you mentioned, is really related to trying to keep the shale players out of the market and reduce those marginal players. Is the decision so far by the GCC related to that, or is it related to other marginal players like Russia, maybe countries like Colombia, independently of the aspects that you mentioned on offshore production or other technologically challenging aspects?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is I don't think that it was targeted at anyone particularly. The way I think about it is that you only know when the oil price is too high afterwards. You only know when the oil price was too low afterwards. And there was a realization that the oil price was probably higher than was sustainable given the cost structures of a whole variety of different opportunities. As Secretary Abraham said, you could go almost anywhere and open up new basins, and that would be value accretive. So I think that it's not that it's specifically targeted at shale gas. I would argue that the extraordinary comparative advantage that the North American industry has in terms of great infrastructure that shortens cycle times, service companies that are always innovating, and maybe most importantly, small acreage blocks, which means that an awful lot of players can use the lottery mentality. It doesn't always have to be big enough for the major company to be interested. It can be big enough that it's life-changing for the small company, and they try stuff. So I don't think there was an expectation that a particular segment could be taken out, and we've seen, there's a slowing in the growth of shale production, but not a huge reversal. But the dice will fall where they will, and we'll find out. Who was it? Was it Warren Buffett who said, it's only when the tide goes out we can tell who's been skinny dipping? That when the oil price falls, the people who don't have the low-cost structures are the ones that will become the marginal and potentially the failing producers.
Secretary Abraham, following on what David just said, is the U.S. the new market power? Are the shale producers going to be the ones that actually set marginal prices rather than the OPEC? Has the shift of production strength of the U.S. changed the market strength as well?
There we go. Sorry. I think to some degree, I mean, certainly, I envy Secretary Smith and Secretary Moniz, with whom he works, because it's nice to, when I was the Energy Secretary, the United States was seeing declining production, increasing imports, great concern about the degree of energy security that we had given those factors. And I'm sure if I were Secretary, I'd be taking as much credit as I could for this change that has happened. But because of good policies, and also because, of course, of entrepreneurs and companies, that has reversed. I think certainly the U.S. now is a much more relevant player. I don't want to say it's replaced OPEC. In fact, I think maybe some of the reactions of the Saudis and of OPEC, in the last year or so are a response to way too many articles that said the U.S. is the new Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's a certain point where I think that people say, well, maybe they ought to see what happens if we don't always do these price stabilizing production decisions. But the U.S. obviously is going to be a significant player, and I don't think, just back to the previous point that was made, I really do not think the goal was to try to destroy the shale industry or some of these other conspiracy theories that we've listened to. It's really an effort by the Saudis to somehow hurt Iran or to hurt the Russians or whatever. I think it's what, as I said, where I think the Saudis are coming from is very simply that if they acted unilaterally to push prices back up, they would be losing market share. And not just OPEC countries, but non-OPEC countries would be gaining market share. And I think they felt that this burden should be shared a little bit more, unlike the past where they had shouldered it all themselves. And they were willing to do that when their fellow club members were the beneficiaries. I don't think they're willing to be the singular bearer of these burdens going forward.
To be clear, they weren't always that happy about handing it over to their fellow club members.
Right, but more willing than clearly to have people that are not members and people that are perhaps not aligned with them. Yeah.
All three of you mentioned the CO2 reductions and the new world that this might bring in terms of electric cars becoming more important and projects potentially being selected on that basis. Is the new reality around CO2 emissions going to phase out fossil fuels over the next generation?
The short answer is no. So that's not going to happen. So in the United States, for example, 40% of the electricity that's produced in the United States comes from better? Okay. So 40% of the electricity that is produced in the United States comes from coal. That's not going to change dramatically overnight.
Apparently not.
Do we need that one?
The soccer expert has also the right microphone.
Okay. All right, is that better? Was it me? So 40% of the electricity that's produced in the United States comes from coal, and that's not going to change dramatically overnight. Now, we do have to develop technologies that will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired power plants, just like we'll have to come up with technologies for producing natural gas and ensure that we don't have fugitive methane emissions. So all of the technologies that are being developed, be it nuclear, wind, solar, enhanced geothermal, oil and natural gas with reduced emissions, carbon capture and sequestration for industrial sources and for coal, are all going to be important. It's going to be a portfolio of technological innovations that leads us towards getting CO2 emissions down to sustainable levels. So all the energy sources are going to play a role, and it's easy to see that oil and gas is going to continue to have a really important role in all the economies of the world. But it's going to require some new thinking in terms of doing things in a way that manage emissions.
Yeah, I agree. As I tried to lay out, I think the point I'm trying to make is just that you've got a variety of new factors into the mix. One of those factors is that whether it's official government regulation or it's merely consumer choice, is causing people to move in the direction, with regard to transportation sector, of more fuel efficiency. And that has an impact on demand. And the other thing that's happening is that many more places than were ever expected to produce oil are now available to produce oil, and a lot more that haven't yet been tapped. And so that's going to have an impact on supply. And the combination of those two, I think, means that we've gone in a very short period of time from a period in which we thought that it would be very hard, for instance, by 2035 or 2040 for supply to keep up with demand. We now see the reverse. Just a couple of years ago, as I said, I would give a speech in which I'd be talking about the other challenge. But just in terms of projections from both the Energy Information Administration that is at the Department of Energy in Washington and the International Energy Agency have significantly reduced the projected 2040 demand levels of oil. And so that combination just changes really the psychology of the market considerably.
They're both right, but I'm going to suggest that it's possible they're also both wrong. It depends. Historically, governments have always been prepared to make the following trade. They will use cheap energy to sustain and encourage economic development and the welfare of society, versus the long-term potential risks associated with carbon emissions. That may change, and if that does change, then it won't necessarily just be policy that will drive it. It will be continuing innovation supported by policy. And when we get to a point at which, it turns out it wasn't policy to use motor cars instead of horses. There were some serious environmental concerns about horses, mostly to do with the effluent of horses in city centres. That was the unsustainability of horses. Government policy wasn't what drove motor cars. It was that motor cars were, had less attitude than horses, in my experience. So I would suggest that we could actually see a change where we do actually see a reduction in demand, but it won't be just because of what happens in Paris in COP21. It won't be because of sustained government policy. It will be because of a combination of a preparedness to change the basic deal between short-term welfare and long-term welfare, and because of continuing innovation in alternatives to fossil fuels.
Now, given that I think the three of you agreed that fossil fuels will not be disappearing, at least not in the short term, I think the short-term needs is now to make sure that companies reduce costs and governments help companies reduce costs, as all three of you mentioned. So what should companies do in this new environment to reduce costs, and how should governments help companies reduce costs? Let's start with you,
Okay.
Secretary Abraham. Yeah, just to solve the problem
Well,
here.
I noticed last time that David was quick to hand the microphone to me, and I should have sensed he was going to disagree after that. I alluded to a few things earlier. I think the way to reduce costs is to address things, as I mentioned, like infrastructure, address, the costs of doing business that relate to regulations and permitting and so on. Now, obviously, there's got to be a balance between permitting processes that take into account the health, the safety, and the environment as you do energy projects. But if these are multi-layered, that is national, then provincial, then local, and if you're repeating processes and steps along the way, all of those kinds of regulatory hurdles that have to be overcome are costly. And companies are feeling that, I think, anywhere they're doing business. And the ability to try to streamline the process consistent with your health, safety, and environmental concerns is first and foremost. Infrastructure, I would put very high. Tax policy obviously is high, but it has to be, balanced against, government budgets and so on. But I think all of those, and there are certainly more, but those are the kinds of competitive steps that come to my mind, and I'm sure there are others.
Okay, very good. Many of us got to hear the Vice President of the Republic speak yesterday and spoke very enthusiastically about all the things that are happening in Colombia. And kind of, he gave two speeches, right? He gave one speech that said, here's all the infrastructure projects we're going to do, and it just ran down the list and talked about all the things that are building, things that are getting built, things that are important for Colombia, important for the communities. Very exciting. And then shifted to the second speech that said, oh, but we don't have any drilling going on, and we have to make sure that we can pay for this stuff. So here's the things we're going to do in the oil and gas sector to make sure that we're continuing to produce and that we can have the income that the country needs even in this low price environment. And kind of something kind of struck me in that kind of bifurcation of those two messages was there are things that will happen in developing infrastructure that will make it more economic, make it more viable, make it more feasible for companies to actually explore in areas in which that's been very lightly explored here in Colombia. And it's kind of there's a holistic way of looking at that says, it's positive to build infrastructure because people demand it and you need to have it to increase the quality of life. But also thinking about sequencing, the sequence of infrastructure projects that helps create an environment in which companies have more economic and more feasible and more efficient access to areas of the country in which you haven't had lots of exploration production activity would be something that's really, really positive for the country. And so seeing those two messages combine into one, and how the first message actually augments the second, which then helps build the first, I think would be a real positive way of thinking about things. Second thing I'll say very quickly is that, I've had an opportunity to meet with senior government officials from all the different entities of the government, from the ministry on down, and I just personally have been just really extremely impressed with the spirit of innovation, the intellectual curiosity, the understanding of the task ahead that I've seen from the officials I've had the pleasure of meeting with. So I'm very optimistic that as Colombia kind of turns the page, moves into the post-accord period, and thinks about all these difficult challenges that accompany a low price environment, but also the opportunities to explore offshore and perhaps in some lightly explored areas in the middle of the country, I'm really optimistic that there's a great future ahead here.
So I too was impressed by the Vice President of the Republic's speech yesterday. I'm also very impressed that Colombia has been successful in recent years because it's placed pragmatism ahead of ideology. And in that spirit, I offer the suggestion that maybe 80 kilometers per hour is just a little slow for that southern road that he mentioned. 85, 86 might be a more pragmatic speed limit. But setting that to one side and realizing I may not get to leave having disagreed with the Vice President on such an important issue, there's a reason that the expression is necessity is the mother of invention rather than, just a vague feeling of dissatisfaction is the mother of all invention. The industry has coped with a halving of oil prices before. It standardized, it eliminated waste, it made itself more efficient. Exactly as Secretary Abraham said, there is absolute confidence that the combination of governments and companies and other stakeholders in the ecosystem will find a way of maintaining competitiveness because the alternative really isn't attractive. And so for that reason, I'm absolutely confident that we will see costs coming down. Just one very small example in Brazil, there are plenty of examples of how policy can go awry, but a commercial policy that's been very successful is the realization that geologists often know less about the reservoir than engineers know about the facility they're going to put on top. That actually it turns out you might as well just standardize the FPSOs rather than trying to customize them to what the geologists thought might be down there and then turned out not to be right. And that has led to enormous cost savings just through standardization. Other companies have used standardization in other areas. I think this is one of the main areas where not trying to optimize every time, but to come up with standardized approaches, economy of scope rather than economy of scale.
Well, I think we have been extremely fortunate of having the three of you here today. And David, you can make sure that despite pragmatism, or in addition to pragmatism, we're a democratic country, you can contradict the Vice President and still go home. I'd like to just summarize, I think, three aspects that I think we learned from the three of you. One is, I think we are in a new world. Demand and supply conditions on the one hand, CO2 emissions challenges on the other, really set the stage for a new world in which we're living. And that requires certainly a new vision for that. And for that, I think it's cost reduction on the company side and government challenges to help those costs to be reduced. And I think all three of you mentioned the need to reduce the time to have basically first oil exploration, and that will require a lot of work. The third thing is that we're also in a new world with the US. I think the shale gas and oil success leads other countries that so far saw that as a natural market to rethink how to be able to compete in the US and elsewhere. We are very fortunate to have had you here, to have learned from you and with you, and thank you so very much for having been with us.